listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the Podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood. I'm joined today by Angela Hollowell. She is the podcast host and producer of Honey and Hustle. Angela, welcome to the show.
Hey, Heather, thank you so much for having me.
So I would love to just have you tell us a little bit about yourself for people maybe who aren't familiar with your podcast. How did you get started in the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I started Honey and Hustle as a video podcast. I started it in March of 2020, so I'm a pandemic podcaster. I started it not even a year after I moved to North Carolina. I just saw just such a huge uptick in the willingness of business owners in North Carolina to be open and be transparent about their experiences and to give advice when I needed it and insight when I needed it. And I was like, I feel like everybody should have access to this. It definitely
Mhm.
wasn't something that I had when I started, but something that I greatly benefited from as I was getting more serious about wanting to be a creator full time and really have access to just real life stories that were relatable that I could apply to my own experience. So that was kind of the impetus for me starting the show. For me keeping going, I wasn't aware that I could just stop. I just took it kind of as a creative pursuit that I was like, yeah, I want to get better at this. I want to get better as an interviewer. As a filmmaker, I'm typically behind the camera. So being in front of the camera was a big step. Being on the mic was a big step. Hearing my voice back was weird, but I wanted to get better and I wanted to make the information more accessible to people. And so that's just been kind of the goal ever since in terms of keeping going and maintaining the show.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that story. I was going to ask about the fact that you started as a video podcast. I feel like that is such a huge topic of conversation right now. It's just the whole video podcast, like who should be on video. Obviously, as a filmmaker, I'm sure you probably were swayed more toward video because of that. But tell me a little bit about why you chose video instead of just doing audio.
Yeah, video for me just felt really innate. I didn't see myself just sitting down and recording anything with just voices. That just was never my way as a creator. I'm very much a visual person. When I started, even then, there was not a lot of gear that was really meant for video podcasters, not in the way that we're spoiled today. I just remember like even just editing platforms, there's really only like Premiere and DaVinci. Now there's Descript and Riverside you can edit in and just all these different things that just really make the process so much easier. And I'm sure there's an AI tool out there somewhere doing something. But when I started, there was none of that. There was no wireless interview logs. There was a lot of that is fairly new, definitely new in the last 5 years. So it's been really interesting to see the space evolve as it becomes a more popular topic of conversation. And it's interesting to see some of the conversations around, the validity of a video podcast. A lot of people still are hung up on that name instead of creating just a good show, I think. And that's just what I've been focused on ultimately. And what I tell people too, it's like it's not a question of should you be on video, it's what is going to make the best show, what's going to make the best
Mhm.
experience for your audience. And that's something to think about.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. So we found you because you presented at Podcast Movement. And at Podcast Movement, you talked about community building, which was really intriguing to me. I think one of the things that is interesting about podcasting and a little bit challenging is that it can be really one-sided. Obviously, in an interview podcast, it's great because you've got the other person and you're interacting and you're, chatting. But from a listener and an audience perspective, they can be very siloed, even though the audience is super engaged and they feel very much like they know the host. They also can't talk back, right? I know obviously there's been like Fireside and different, things that have come on the market to try and create that. But what really made you focus on community building as a topic that you wanted to talk about?
I think it's because it was something that I failed at early on too.
Interesting.
I think that again, like when I started, I was publishing a video to Facebook and YouTube, and this is back when Facebook was relatively calmer. Um, and even then, the conversations were coming in, and YouTube has a comment section, but after the first season, I was like, okay, well, this is a podcast, maybe I should put it on streaming. But Spotify, Apple, Overcast, they don't have comment sections. I mean,
Mhm.
Spotify is trying to change that now, but I don't know anybody that's using it regularly, to have conversations. So in terms of having that two-way street from the audio perspective, that was really missing early on for me. And that was
Mhm.
a gap that I felt. And then as someone who's also had to change their podcast host a couple of times, that was also hard. So it's like hard to quantify like who exactly is listening, right?
Mhm.
Like where are they? Where are they listening? Where are they coming from? How do they find the show? What's resonating with them? What do they like about it? Why do they keep coming back with every new episode? And that's something that I wanted to really bridge the gap on. I wanted maybe just for personal curiosity too, like who am I speaking with? And so when I started the newsletter, it was almost like adding a comment section to the podcast.
Mm.
And even now that the audience has grown, and I've been writing my newsletter, Please Hustle Responsibly, for about a year and a half now, people will share the episodes on LinkedIn. They figured out that that's where I hang out online, and so they will share them if they like them, or they'll send me feedback online, or they'll respond to my newsletter. All these things that don't show up on a typical stat sheet that really are the things that make the difference, I believe, right? Knowing that people are listening, knowing that they're real people, knowing that they feel comfortable enough to talk to you and tell you what they like and what resonated with them, I think means everything. And, also in terms of advertisers, I felt like I was getting more successful in having the conversation around who exactly is listening to my show when I started the newsletter, right? Because now I can say, oh, it's these people, and this is where they hang out online, and this is what they're interested in. And so I think for me, having that talk at Podcast Movement, I wasn't sure how many people were going to be interested in it. I wasn't sure if that was something that people talked about a lot. I think community sometimes gets looped in with marketing
Mhm.
and, how to grow your show, and that's totally fine, totally relevant. But also, I think newsletters are different from social media and podcast guesting and other forms of marketing in that they're a deeper connection, almost like a podcast too. So it's almost like a one-to-one of who would be interested in a podcast, who would be interested in a newsletter. It's definitely not something that I expect to ever go viral. So there's that. It's just a different type of connection and relationship building. And I just felt like it's been really helpful for me and thought it might be helpful for someone else.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that. So you decided that the best way to kind of build that community was through a newsletter. Like, what was the first step that you took? Did you just ask your listeners to sign up, or what did that look like?
Yeah, I kind of tiptoed my way into it. At first, I tried to automate it via MailChimp and using an RSS feed. That was terrible. And I got like maybe two issues in and was like, yeah, this is terrible, actually. I wouldn't actually want to read this. And then I tried playing around on Medium because it's
Mm.
just free to post and just I just wanted to see like could I put together an article that I would want to read and can I play around with different formats. And as I went deeper into my research of like, okay, like I've tried the Medium thing, let's see what's out there. I found my way to Substack, which is where some incredible writers are, and started to see, okay, like here's how I can kind of find my voice in this. And yes, share my podcast, but also share different things that maybe lend themselves to my expertise as a host. Like, yes, I am also a creative entrepreneur who interviews other creators and other entrepreneurs, but what shapes my philosophy as a business owner? What are the things that attracts me to certain guests? What are the things that draw me to certain topics on the show? And
Mhm.
how can I expound on those things in the newsletter? Another thing that I was seeing with my podcast, I did a solo episode in 2023 and it hit like gangbusters. I was like, oh, people are coming back for me. Like they want to hear me. I didn't
Yeah.
know that. Maybe I should talk to them. And so the newsletter was also a way for me to maybe put more of my voice out there, more of my personality out there, and match that with maybe my thoughts and experiences. So there are a lot of ways that I tried to do it. Substack just ended up being where I fell into and I gave myself a cadence that also helped. It wasn't like, oh, I'll just do it when I have an episode. It was like, no, like every Monday and Thursday, I need to be publishing something. And I stuck to that for a year. And I was like, yeah, this is one of the best decisions I've ever made for sure.
Interesting. And how long ago did you launch your newsletter?
I got serious about it on Substack in December 2023. That's when I started the
Oh,
twice a week cadence. Yeah.
wow. And you feel free to share however much or however little you want. But when you look at the newsletter and you look at the podcast, how do they equal in terms of like audience size? Is the podcast larger than the newsletter, or is the newsletter now gotten larger than the podcast? What does that look like?
That's a good question. For me, it's hard to quantify. I would say that overall, the podcast, and I kind of loop in YouTube as well, the
Hmm.
podcast and YouTube channel are probably bigger than the newsletter. But I will say that the newsletter, because I post more consistently on the newsletter, just gets more consistent growth. So I think in the year and a half that I've been writing, it's definitely grown to be a little over half of what my podcast and YouTube audience is. So I expect, and I started those again in 2020. So in 5 years of writing the newsletter, I think it's going to be massively bigger than, or at least equal to what the podcast and YouTube will be at that time.
Hmm. And do you have any sense of how many people are listening to the podcast and also reading the newsletter? That's a question that I always have when it comes to content, and especially looking at it from an advertising perspective. It's like, okay, well, if we have the podcast, the video podcast, the newsletter, socials, how much crossover from an audience perspective is there? And there isn't really a tool. There's a tool called Bumper that is measuring audience size across YouTube, podcast downloads, and streaming on Spotify. So that tool is pretty interesting, but there isn't really a tool out there, to my knowledge, that allows us to kind of look at audience and overlap. So you kind of have to almost take it on gut, but do you have a sense of what the overlap looks like?
Yeah, it's hard to quantify. If I had to guess, it's probably about a 25% overlap between the podcast and the newsletter. And part of that is just because of how people find the podcast and the newsletter. It's completely different. For the newsletter, I would say maybe about a third comes from LinkedIn. And so a lot
Mm-hmm.
of people on LinkedIn are probably people that are listening to my podcast because I post social clips on there. And those are people, of course, that are more business minded. They're probably interested in that sort of thing. So that's where they're coming from. Another third is from recommendations.
Hmm.
So people coming from recommendations. And so those people have no idea who I am. They only know the newsletter, right? And so they probably aren't coming to the podcast until they subscribe to the newsletter. And then probably the last third is when I do events, like when I speak at stuff like Podcast Movement, when I speak on other people's podcasts, when I do collaborations with other podcasters, that sort of thing. So that's an element of discovery as well. And those probably are my big three in terms of discovery. So for the podcast, it's a little bit different. Yes, some social media for sure, some events for sure, but then also just recommendations from other podcasters. So sometimes when other podcasters mention you on their show, YouTube, of course, has discovery. So people just discovering you through search. And then, of course, guest sharing. So when guests share their episodes, that's an element of discovery. So I think part of it is, it's never going to be 100% of people that subscribe to your newsletter listen to your podcast because of how they find each media platform.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And I believe everybody has a preferred method of consuming content, right? It's like, you know, I love audio, but not everybody does. Some people really love newsletters. So it just depends. But again, getting back to the whole community aspect, the nice thing about the newsletter is that people can respond. And I guess I'm curious, like, how much interaction do you feel like that's given you to have that? And do people now, I guess, do you feel more connected to your audience because you're able to have that two-way conversation?
Absolutely, 1,000%. The replies every month, there's not a month that goes by that I don't get a reply to at least one newsletter. That to me feels amazing. People sharing the newsletter, people commenting. Um, I think on when I share the newsletter on social media, I think it's just opened up a different way for people to communicate. It's one thing for you to post a text post or even a video post that everybody loves on any social media platform. Sure, you may get some comments, but I think having someone spend the time, even if it's a 5 to 10 minute read every week, to read that, respond to it, engage with it, like it, comment on it, that means so much more. And to me, it's just really informed how I create what I create and help me understand what my audience wants and resonates with the most. And it's also given me, I think, the freedom to try new things and experiment and be able to get that direct feedback of what
Mhm.
people are liking and not liking. For example, in an effort to kind of bridge the audio and the written. I did an audio newsletter. So I wrote a post, I recorded myself reading it, and I published it to my feed. And I embedded that in the newsletter and said, hey, if you want to just hear me read this to you, you can click below. If not, you can read it for yourself. I don't care. And I put a little poll at the bottom that just said, hey, how did we feel about an audio newsletter? And just had three options. Was like, I loved it. Oh, I thought it was all right. No, I never want to do this again. Something like that. And a lot of responses. So not only did people vote, but they also left comments too, which is a feature available in Beehive, which is where I publish my newsletter. So incredible things like that. It's like, you don't have to try five different audio newsletters and compare the open rates or the engagement or the clicks. It's like I can do one, get feedback. I can see who listened to it based on my podcast host. I can see what the open rates are in terms of people reading it. I can see the click map to see how far people got down into the article, and then I can see who voted on it in the poll and what they thought about it. So just in terms of feedback, it's been incredible. I highly recommend
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, I love that. So I'm super curious, what was people's feedback about the reading of the newsletter?
So one was interesting. So they read it, they voted on the poll, they left a comment, and then they DM'd me on LinkedIn and they're like, thank you so much for doing this. So I get so many newsletters and I save them, but I never go back and read them. But with this, I can just like press play and listen to it on my commute to work, which is what I did this morning. So it's like, oh, great. Like, this is how people are engaging with this. That's awesome. And then I had someone that commented on Beehive. They voted on the poll and they're like, yes, I love this. Finally, I get an audio version of this for a longer post. So I think it's been cool to see, like, and there was one reason I did it too is because it was a longer read. And I was like,
Mm.
okay, if I'm sending this at like 7 o'clock in the morning, people are getting ready for work. It's unlikely they're going to take, I think it was like an 11-minute read. I was like, they're not going to take this
Oh,
time. So I
yeah.
was like, maybe let me try an audio like version of this. And it did gangbusters. So I think it was really cool to see that.
Yeah, no, for sure. I love that. I actually just recently bought an app called Speechify, and I would give it like a B plus, maybe C minus. It's okay, but I do really like it because even like for work stuff, like when I'm getting ready, if somebody's like, "Oh, Heather, I need you to like review this document," I can just listen to it while I'm getting ready. And again, lover of audio. So like I feel like it's been great, but I think that's a genius idea. I love the idea of reading the newsletter, especially when it's a longer read, right? To me, if it's anything like north of 5 minutes, like doing a recording seems like it makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, yeah. So that was a cool experiment. I think too, like audio newsletters are coming into the conversation a little bit as
Mhm.
well. And I think they're, again, part of it is that I think newsletter companies like Beehive, like Substack, like ConvertKit, they're seeing that some of the biggest creators are podcasters now.
Mm,
And it's like, what does a podcaster need? What
right.
would they need in their ecosystem, and how can we make that transition from audio to writing more seamless for them? And I think that's where the audio newsletters are going to come into play.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. So if you were talking with a podcaster and obviously or giving a panel or a presentation at an event, and you had to recommend how podcasters can better create engagement with their listeners and create a community, what would your recommendation be? I mean, obviously your experiences with newsletter, but if somebody was wanting to kind of take that step to create that engagement, what does that look like?
Definitely starts with a newsletter of some kind. It doesn't necessarily have to be on Beehive. I started on Substack, which is completely free. ConvertKit has a free plan. It's called Kit now, but most people probably know it as ConvertKit.
I don't like
Bee
that they changed the name to Kit. I don't think that that's a good name. Just my 2 cents. They know, want it, I'm sure.
That's so funny. I don't have a huge opinion on it, but it felt like a big act to do for them, so
It's
good for
just I
them.
don't like it when people make their names too simple because it's like if I'm looking for Kit, I'm gonna come up with a bazillion things on my search, like, but not with ConvertKit. So
Yeah.
sorry, side note. But yes, so they could use ConvertKit or Kit.
Yeah. Beehive also has a free plan. I think the main thing is, again, like not to try to regurgitate talking at someone, which is
Mm,
sometimes what a podcast can feel like, and really use the text wisely to create moments for your audience to engage back with you. Ask them questions, put polls in, encourage them to leave a comment with their thoughts, encourage them to share the newsletter, encourage them to respond to you. And you'd be surprised how many people will, just because
mhm.
they know that the door is open now and they can do that. And also just don't be afraid to stray away from strictly sharing episodes from your show. Like use it as a space to really create a one-to-one conversation. Like I write it like you're writing to one person would be my recommendation.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that that is so important with podcasting too. I think that sometimes podcasters talk like they're speaking to like a crowd of thousands and a really, even if they are speaking to thousands of people, they're speaking to one person. And I think that that's really an important distinction that when someone is listening, they feel like they're the only one listening, right? They're being spoken to. So, are there other mistakes that you feel like creators make when they're trying to engage with their audience?
I don't know about mistakes, but I can maybe share a few interesting comments and questions that I got at Podcast Movement that I think are
Yeah.
indicative of how people view newsletters and view community building. One of the reasons why I think it took me a long time to really come to writing a newsletter or a blog or whatever you want to call it is because a lot of the newsletters that I was getting previously were kind of salesy almost. Like you understood that when you open this, yes, you may get a nugget of wisdom to take away from it, but you're also going to be sold something. More often than not, you're going to be sold something. And I didn't start my podcast to sell anybody anything. I started it because I really cared about the topic and the people. And so it's hard for me to like reimagine what a newsletter could be in terms of not thinking of it as like an e-commerce vehicle, but like a really a relationship vehicle. And I think too, one of the questions I got was from a podcaster who was like, "Hey, I want to sell merch. Can I use Substack as like my newsletter platform to sell merch exclusively?" Like I don't want to write anything. I just want to hit people up to buy my merch. And it's like, you can, but if people know that you every time they get an email from you, it's because you're trying to sell them something, they're just going to stop opening. So that's going to kill your open rates. People are going to unsubscribe. Your audience isn't going to grow. And let's say you do later on down the line want to use this as a vehicle for conversation, maybe get sponsors for your podcast and your newsletter simultaneously, like you're hurting your ability to gain your audience's trust when you do that. And I think too that has to be a part of the equation if you're thinking about starting a newsletter community is how can I use this to build trust, not destroy it?
Mhm. Right.
And building trust really does take consistency. So maybe don't overcommit to a schedule. Don't say you're going to do it every day if you can't do it every day. That it may be
Hmm.
unrealistic at first. Even if you have a daily podcast, like it can be really hard to add another daily something onto that workflow. And then, just showing up in a way that feels true to you. Don't write something for the sake of writing something if you know it's going to be bad. Wait until it's ready. And then again, if you are going to sell something, which I'm not mad about, I'm not opposed to, but make sure the ask is genuine and it's not just that's not the only ask that you have of your audience.
Right.
That's all I can say.
Yeah. No, I think that that's all really good advice. How important do you think community is to advertisers?
I think it's becoming a growing measure of importance, right?
Mhm.
I think that the big podcast boom or Liquid Death and Athletic Greens and insert whatever brand that was spending millions of dollars on podcast ads, I think we've maybe evened that out a little bit, and that's for a few reasons. I think one is because maybe if someone's downloads said they were getting 5,000 downloads a month or something, and the podcaster was paid according to their audience size or their monthly downloads, and the brand didn't see a return, that kind of burned the brand a little bit. They're like, okay, we spent all this money, we didn't sell enough product or get enough clicks to justify the money that we spent. Right. So I think brands are really concerned about can a podcaster really quantify their audience?
Mhm.
Number one. Number two is the bundling effect. I think people love a good bundle, and that's true for brands as well. They're like, how can we get in front of the widest array of this person's audience in the deepest way possible? And when we look at deep audience connection, you're thinking it's one of probably three things: long form YouTube, long form podcast, and long form articles. So if we can get two of the three with one person, that's even better, right? We don't have to go searching for a separate newsletter writer who doesn't have a podcast, who maybe have a similar audience size. We can kind of get this all in one. And we know that this is an audience that's engaged and that's interested in what we're selling. So I think for those two reasons, in terms of discovery and in terms of depth and in terms of quantification, I think newsletters really help with all of those things in an easier way, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Angela, thank you so much for being on the show today. If people want to subscribe to your newsletter or listen to your podcast, where's a good place for them to find you?
They can find everything that I'm working on my personal website, www.angelahollowell.com. You can find my newsletter, my podcast, whatever I'm working on is on that site. So,
Awesome. Well, thank you for being on the show.
yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode. I hope that you have enjoyed it. We don't talk about newsletters a ton here on the show, so it's been a great conversation. And if you are trying to build community and engagement with your audience, which you definitely should, this episode gave you some great tips. So thank you for listening, and we will catch you again next episode. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.